Hi, this is Joe Folkman, president of Zinger Folkman, and thanks for joining us today as we discuss competency models. I've spent about 40 years in this field doing a lot of work in competency models, and I'd like to share some of the insights I've gained through the years. Now, part of this webinar, what we want to do is get your opinion on things, and so we're going to do some live polling. If you have a mobile phone, you can do this by sending the text message ZF poll to the number 22333. Or you can launch your browser and go to pollev.com/ZF poll. And when you bring those up, you should get a message back that you're joining the Zinger Folkman meeting. If you go to the browser, it actually asks you to put in your name. You don't have to do that. We're not going to use that. What we want to do is practice a little bit just to give you a little bit of sense about how that works. I've got somewhat of a silly poll here of what kind of device are you using. Apple, Android, Windows, or other. Now, if you're texting, you just text in the A or B or C or D. On some of the polls we give you, we're going to let you put in multiple answers if you have them, and you just need to separate them by a space, and you can do multiple answers on that. Well, if you'd start that poll, we're starting to see the results come in. Surprise, surprise, it looks like Apple's winning a little bit, but others are good. Looks like we have people on every device, and, well, things change. These polls, sometimes as more results come in, it changes the number. Well, you get this. So let's go on to the next poll. And in this question, we're asking you, how long has your organization had its current competency model? A, 1 year, B, 1 to 3 years, C, 4 to 6 years, and D, 6 years and above. We've started to see a kind of interesting thing. On the one end, we've seen a lot of organizations that really have used these models for quite a long time. They're tried and true, and they're not changing them at all. And then we see other organizations that are really asking the question, well, what's critical today, and they're changing their models? Well, the results seem to be all across the board. We have people, some that are just new, and some that are oldies but goodies, I imagine. Well, that's interesting. Well, let's continue on here, and what I want to do is talk about the purpose of competency models. I don't know if you've ever watched the Olympics. I love the Olympic diving, the 10-meter diving. I mean, that is so scary to me. And I look at people get on that diving board and jump into the water. And when I see that first dive, I just go, oh my gosh, that was incredible. And what's fascinating is I then see the judges come up and the commentators, and they'll say things like, did you see that splash? And did you see the bend in his arm or her arm? The numbers come up in 2s and 3s and 1s. Evidently, what I thought was great was pathetic. But if I watch diving for a while, I start to learn what to pay attention to. Now, the purpose of a competency model is to identify skills and behaviors that enable employees at all levels of the organization to be more effective. What competency models do is tell you when you win points and when we take points away. And we identify the specific behaviors that we think are critical in this organization and are going to make a difference. Now, we're going to argue that it ought to be more than a theory, that what we ought to put in a competency model is behaviors that really do make a difference. Well, after doing this for a long time, I've had some interesting examples or experiences around this. One is I came into an organization and they said to me, we've created an absolutely unique competency model. We're the only ones with these behaviors, and they showed it to me. And as I looked across the competency model, I smiled and I said, well, about 80% of what you have here is in every other competency model I've ever seen. And so one of the observations we have is that there are some common competencies that exist across all companies and cultures. It doesn't matter whether we're in Russia or France or the US or Canada or China. We found there are common competencies. There are behaviors that work, that are useful, that really make a difference, and there's a consistent set of these behaviors. We have 22 distributors across the world, and we have been really amazed at how consistent some of these behaviors are across different organizations and cultures and companies. Now, a second observation would be there are some unique competencies that are critical in some organizations. So usually with a generic model, you get an 80% fit, but you don't get 100% fit. So there are some unique things in every culture or company that seem to make a difference. And I want to kind of start off with that thinking as we sort of dive into the 5 factors here. What we found is as I thought about competency models, there's 5 factors that make a competency model effective and useful and really make a difference in your organization. The first one is the common language. The second one, competency models help people understand where to focus their development. Now, we found that competency models are a lot more important if they're integrated into other talent management processes. The core idea of a competency model is that they are behaviors that will impact outcomes. Now, your ability to take your competency model and actually predict those outcomes, we think is a critical element in having a successful competency model. The killer for most competency models, the thing that ruins them, is complexity. So let's talk about these things one at a time. Let's start with a common language. Several years ago, I did some work with PepsiCo, and at that time, they had several divisions. Each division had a unique competency model. This became really complex at corporate. Even if they had the same competency, like drive for results, it was called drive for results in one organization and execution in another division. This made it really difficult for them to talk about how people were performing, how people were doing in their various positions. As they thought about the competency models, they were designed to run the division, but they weren't designed to help corporate run the organization. And so the decision was made that they were going to create a universal competency model to be used in every division. Of course, there was a lot of negative feedback about that, but once it was completed, everyone seemed to embrace it because now there was a common language, and people in a division knew what they needed to do to perform well at the corporate level. But these were also dimensions that worked at the division level. Well, having a common language is critical for success in an organization, and a competency model can give you that common language. We're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go through this presentation. The second thing that a competency model can do is they can define a development target. Now, usually as an individual contributor, there's lots of things you could do to develop, and people may be very confused about, well, where do I focus my development? A competency model gives you a target. They give you a set of behaviors that the organization says are critical for you to be successful. Now, when people think about development, they start off, and I would start off by saying, well, what do I love doing? What do I want to do? What do I enjoy doing? If you left development just up to me, then I would choose stuff to develop that I like. that I enjoy, that I think are important for me. But the problem is, what does the organization need? What's critical here in this company, in this organization? And if all I'm thinking about is what I want to develop, then that might not help the organization. If the organization forces me to only do the things that it wants to do, then you lose my passion. And so we think we need to kind of incorporate my passion, because we found that people who are developing something they love, surprise, surprise, tend to do a lot better job of improving on it. And so there's an integration between my passion and the organization needs. The third thing that we need to look at is competence. The worst person at judging their competence is the person themselves. We found that they either overrate their competence or underrate their competence. And they're not only wrong about things they're not good at, but they're really confused about what their strengths are. So we created this CPO model, and we think it's a key to helping people think about development. The three questions are, what am I passionate about? What do I love to do? But that needs to fit into, what does the organization need from me, which needs to connect to, where's my strengths? Do I have a fatal flaw, or do I want to develop a strength? Our approach to development and to competencies has been that we found only about 20 or 25% of individuals we assessed had fatal flaws. They had things they needed to fix. We found the majority of people were better off developing their strengths. So we have that approach, we use this model, and we think about development. Competency models really help with that. So let's talk about this third issue. Competency models are going to be a lot more effective if they're integrated into other talent management processes. There's a variety that we can integrate them into. So for instance, we can integrate them, and usually the 1 and 2 here are the first two to get integrated with. Leadership development. Oftentimes when we develop a competency model, we then develop a 360 and move it into a leadership development process. And for some organizations, we've done that, but when they came to performance management, their performance was judged on a different set of competencies. Well, this created some confusion. So leadership development said these were critical, and then when I went to have my performance review with my manager, we talked about a different set. And then for succession planning, that was a whole nother set of competencies. Career was different, selection was different. We think there's benefits from, integrating them across all 5. So let me give you an example. Let's say that we looked at leadership development, and solving problems and analyzing issues was one of the competencies. You could be assessed on your effectiveness on that competency. We usually use 360 feedback to do that, and you could know your level of performance. And as I said before, we identify if people have a fatal flaw on these things or if they could build a strength. The strength building process we found was very different. You need a different approach. What we've done is research thousands of leaders who were good at solving problems, and we found these things called companion behaviors. We found that the people that were best at solving problems actually took a lot of initiative. You can imagine that person that sits around and says, every problem people give me, I solve. I'm pretty good at this. But the best people went out and found new problems. They actually found problems that weren't problems yet, but would be in the future. That's taking initiative. So we found that working on the companion behavior helps you improve the competency. So I'm not going to go into detail on this. You can learn more about this, and we'd love to show you more of the insights we have on nonlinear development. Let's go on to performance management. One of the ways we've been able to take our competencies and integrate with them with performance management is creating descriptions of different levels. I remember meeting with a president of a division, and I said, how do you do performance reviews? And he says, well, I go through these levels, this document you've given me on the different competencies. I identify the competencies that I think are critical for this person, and then I go through and I read these different levels: meets, exceeds, needs. And I think about where this person's at. This really helps me to prepare me to have a really good performance discussion with this person, because it gives me the language I need to communicate what this person needs to do to move forward. That's what this does for people. And integrating your performance management, your competency model into performance management provides leaders, managers at every level with insights and specifics on how people can get a better score, they can succeed in the future. Another way we've used the competency models in succession planning is by actually calculating people's performance on them and giving something called a heat chart. Now, this is just one way it can be used in succession planning, but helping people understand and helping other leaders understand who has outstanding strengths in particular competencies is a great way to give insight into who's going to be the best leaders in an organization. Career planning is another way. We really strongly recommend that the CPO model is used in career planning, and the competencies really provide a guide for how people can be successful in the future. Another way is selection. In selection, we take the competencies and we create behavioral event interview questions that might help people really assess the level of performance of a person on a particular competency. So as you can see, we've been able to build these competencies into a variety of different HR processes. What that does is create more of a common language. I'm going to see this in leadership development. I'm going to see it in performance management, succession planning, and even in selection. Now, we have another poll that should come up. And where have you integrated your competencies? Have you put them in just leadership development, or B, performance management, C, succession planning, career planning, or E, selection? Now, again, if you're using in them all five of those, just put a space between A, B, C, D, E. Well, the votes are coming in. Boy, it looks like a real variety across all these different dimensions. Some are high and some are low. Wow, that's fascinating. Well, thank you so much for your input on that. I think that gives me some valuable insight into which one of those factors people are using more and which ones less. Let's talk about predictive of outcomes and the importance of doing this. Now, most people in organizations are a little skeptical. And if your theory is that competencies are the behaviors that really affect the performance outcomes, that's a theory. And again, the idea of the predictive of outcomes is the effectiveness of a competency model is determined by its ability to predict positive outcomes. So the kind of the cogs in the wheel here are, we have leadership competencies, and we believe those leadership competencies impact leadership effectiveness or even individual effectiveness, which impacts organizational success factors, right? And that's the theory. Now, can you show me the money? Can you predict with your competency models those outcomes? Because until you show people their data, those outcomes or some outcomes and how people did on the competencies, all it is a theory. Let me just say from the beginning here that not all competencies predict outcomes. Some are not predictive at all. Some are very predictive. And doing the research here really helps you to determine the effectiveness of a study. Let me show you an example of what I mean by this. Several years ago, we did a study with a retail organization in Mexico. We started this study by going down and interviewing store managers and what effective store managers did and what ineffective store managers did. Out of those interviews and a lot of other data, we identified a set of competencies. And from those competencies, we designed a 360 assessment. Based on the 360 assessment we did with 95 store managers, we divided leaders into the bottom 10% up to the top 10%. And then we looked at percentage growth in sales versus the prior year. What we found was a very good correlation between leadership effectiveness on these competencies and the outcome of growth in sales. The worst leaders only had a 0.7, the best leaders had a 7.4. That's a huge difference. Now, when you think about, well, how did that happen? How did they get that difference? We started to look at turnover. Now, this is a retail organization. It wasn't a very good stores that they had. It was kind of low-end stores. So turnover was generally very high. But when we looked at turnover, we found that the worst leaders had about 81% turnover, which is really high. Best leaders had 68. That's still high, but when people quit, who quits? Well, the best people quit. The people with options quit. The best leaders were able to keep their good employees more often than the worst leaders, which led to success in the store. Let me show you another study. This is a study we've done with 66,000 leaders across the globe. This is a huge study. What we're looking at here is leadership effectiveness and employee engagement or commitment. I don't know any one of my clients that isn't interested in improving engagement in their organizations. They believe, and I know, that higher engagement is going to lead to higher customer satisfaction. It's going to lead to increased productivity, increased morale, and reduced turnover. Well, as you look at this graph, you can see the effectiveness of leaders from the 5th percentile up to every 5 percentile points to the 100th percentile. And what we see is that the worst leaders, the poor leaders, their employee engagement scores at the 20th percentile. Now, what we found in organizations is if you take the same employees and we swap out that leader at the 5th percentile for a leader at the 50th percentile, same employees, same pay, same comp, same everything, but engagement will go up to about the 50th percentile with a good leader, and if it's a great leader, it'll go to the 80th percentile. If you can show this study to the people that you're giving the competencies to, all of a sudden this light bulb goes off and they say, oh, I see, these behaviors lead to these outcomes. That's why I'm interested in your survey. These are not just a bunch of fluffy, nice things to do. These behaviors actually impact results. At Zinger-Folkman, our motto is better leaders, better results. Another example of this is what we call the intention to leave. And this graph is done with a large financial services company. It's about 1,700 leaders, but you can see that the intention of lead, the percentage of people that think about quitting, the intention to leave, 70% of the leaders at the 1st to the 10th percentile, 70% of their employees are thinking about quitting. Now, we've actually found that this metric here is a good predictor of turnover. About 50% of the people that think about quitting actually quit. Note that the best leaders, those at the 91st to 100th percentile, only about 5% of those employees are thinking about quitting. This final graph shows you net income. This is a mortgage bank. It's a large study it was a U.S. study, and we had a variety of different units here. But what we found is that poor leaders lost money, good leaders made money, great leaders doubled it. If you can produce studies that show the effect of leadership effectiveness on an outcome, then people will start to pay a lot more attention to the competency model. But also, you'll learn some things. You'll learn which competencies actually predict outcomes and which are just fluff. Well, I'd like to ask the question now on this is a poll where you get to put in words instead of numbers and vote. But what kinds of outcomes are you looking for your leaders? What do you expect? One of our organizations we work with, it was safety. We've actually done a study where we found a connection between leadership effectiveness and safety. Other organizations, it's customer satisfaction. It's engagement for some organizations. Somebody said none. Okay. Well, as you put up some words here, what do you expect? What outcomes are you, and are you thinking about these competencies, these leadership behaviors, and are you connecting them to what outcomes we expect? I'm confident that in every organization we can find clear connections between the right set of leadership behaviors and outcomes that are important in your organization. Well, that's a fascinating chart. Thank you so much for your input on this. Wow, that is really interesting. Let's talk about the last thing, and I think it's last, but it's probably most important. Complexity is a killer, and our theory is it's the top factor rendering a competency model ineffective. My assumption is there's an inverse relationship between the complexity of an organization's competency model and the extent to which it's utilized and valued in an organization. I have to tell you this story. A few years ago, I was with a training session to about 45 executives, and I was introduced by one of the top managers, and he said, well, before I introduce you, I'd like to ask you fellows or you women some questions. And his question was, how many of you here can remember anything about our last competency model? And silence, crickets. And he says, can anybody here remember anything about our last competency model? Once again, nothing, no hands, nothing. Isn't that interesting? I thought that was fascinating. And then he said, well, that's why we're using Zinger-Folkman. Well, one of the things that happens is that sometimes we love to add features, to add on, to build complexity into our competency models. And I'm here to tell you it doesn't help. Now, I've observed some interesting trends. This first trend is one that I thought would be useful. And it was a trend to make competency models shorter and simpler. And I've heard a lot of executives say to me, we go into an organization, we're trying to discover the competencies, and the top executive will say, we can only have 5. It's sort of like going to a doctor and saying, I'm really sick, I've got some really bad things happening to me. I only want 5 procedures done. Well, they may need to do 10, but okay, we're only going to do 5. But I've seen a lot of organizations are trying to simplify by reducing the number of competencies. Here's an example. I received this competency model from one of our clients. They had these 5 competencies: making strategy happen, enterprising, driving profitable execution, leading people courageously, fostering cross-border collaboration. So let me show you what happens often with these models. Because you can only have 5 competencies, people tend to define their competencies in a really complex way. So if you look at enterprising and we look at the behavioral descriptions here, actively seeks more responsibility and influence, acts as a source of specialist knowledge, produces a range of alternative solutions, pushes self hard when faced with difficult targets, can facilitate effective brainstorming. often recommends new ways of working. Now, what's fascinating is they define that competency with 5 competencies. And you can see the competencies I've matched them up to. It's like we're saying enterprising is 5 different things, but we're going to call it one thing. Now, what this does is, the technical term for this is smushing. I've made that up, but I think that's what it is. We're combining several different things together and calling it one thing. This isn't simplifying. This is making development very difficult. It's also making feedback very confusing, because obviously when you get 5 different things together, you're going to get some that are good and some that are bad. And so it's hard for people to identify, well, how do I work on this thing? And it's impossible for us to provide developmental suggestions, because we've smushed 5 different things into one thing, which isn't one thing. It's 5 different things. In our original Extraordinary Leader research, we made an interesting discovery. We discovered that if you could do 3 things well, on average, you'd be at the 81st percentile if you had a strength in 3 things. Well, the takeaways from that was that people didn't need to be perfect. But we also found that people tend to gravitate towards some competencies that they had passion for, and we've talked about passion already, versus others. What's interesting, when you limit the number of competencies, you sort of destroy the options for people to discover their genius. When you get so few that it's like, well, these 5 things, and you go, I'm not good at any of those. Well, it presents a real problem for people, and I don't think it's helping people to develop very much. Another example of the shorter and simpler is this model. I received this a few months ago, and this organization had this set of competencies. When I looked down through the list, I asked the question, are results important to your business? They said, oh, absolutely. They're critical. Why isn't it in the model? Well, we only wanted 6. We couldn't squeeze it in. Well, I think they're sending a message. They're saying, here's the things that are critical for success. When you leave one out, that's an interesting message. Another trend we've seen with competency models is something we call these levels. This is a really attractive kind of idea, this idea that as an individual contributor, here are the competencies that are really critical. And when you move to a team leader, they're going to change. So you need these competencies. And then when you become a manager, they change again. And when you become an executive, they change again. So they're sort of building, it's sort of like building blocks, if you will, and what you need at this level and you don't need at that level. It's an interesting idea. But as you look across all of this, you can see a little bit of complexity. Another way to do this with levels is you have the same set of competencies, but you define them differently for different levels. So individual contributors, drive for results would look like this, and team leader, it looks slightly differently in manager and executive. One of the things that happens, again, as we set up these levels is it increases complexity. And with increased complexity, again, we get utilization going down. Now, we've been able to do this with some of our clients by having the same set of competencies, reducing the number of levels. It worked fairly well. But increasing complexity is a tough thing. We got to wondering on this, about this whole idea of levels. And is it really, do you not do certain competencies at certain levels? So we looked at one that we thought was really pretty straightforward, technical professional expertise. We'd gathered data from hundreds of thousands of ratings on this, and we looked at individual contributors, and we found that when it was rated on importance, it was 5 of 16. It was number 5 of 16. When we looked at it for supervisor, it went down to 9 of 16, middle manager 8 of 16, senior manager 9 of 16, and middle manager 9 of 16. What was fascinating was it didn't go down to 16 or 15 or 14 or 13. It stayed right in the middle. even though most of us would assume that the level that technical professional expertise is really important is just the individual contributor. We looked at a study we did where we looked at the top leaders, the best leaders we could find at senior leaders, at top executives. And we said, what did they do differently? What we found was one of the competencies that differentiated the best senior leaders, top-level leaders, was technical professional expertise. It's interesting. Organizations are becoming more and more complex, and executives with deep knowledge that really understand the technology tend to be very, very critical at the top level of the organization, and that becomes a differentiating quality for them. Another study we did looked at another competency, strategic perspective. Now, I don't know that people would say strategic perspective is really critical for supervisors or even for middle managers. They don't form strategy, right? But when we did studies and we looked at high potentials, we found that the number one skill that they said these high potentials lacked was strategic perspective, yet none of them were in a role that required them to set strategy. But what top manager, what the promoting managers wanted to see is they wanted to see that people had strategic perspective before they actually used it in their job. Again, this is a competency that we feel people need to start developing before they need to use it. But the only way to do that is to have it in the model. The last one was drive for results. I found it fascinating when I looked at some of these models that driving for results was not a top-level competency. I've known a lot of senior leaders, and I didn't know many of them that weren't pretty driven. As you look at this and the importance ranking, you can see individual contributors 7 of 16, supervisor 4 of 16, manager 6, senior leader 3 of 16, top level 4 of 16. It's important at every level. It's critical at every level. So as you think about this whole idea of different competencies are important at different levels, we're finding data that seems to suggest that that may not be true. I want to talk about a model that's helped me think about competency models, and that's the GAS model. Now, what we'd love to have in most solutions, in most competency models, is we'd like something that is general. In other words, it applies across the board. It's accurate. In other words, it fits everybody. And it's simple. Now, you don't always get that. So we were striving for that. This is 20 years ago. We met with a client. We talked them into doing competency models. We were intrigued by the value of a competency model. And what we thought is if we could go into each unit, each group, and create a unique competency model for that group, that would help them understand what they needed to do. So we did. We went into every one of the units, and these were small units, and we created a competency model for that unit. And then we thought, well, wouldn't it be great if we leveled it so that we had the senior executive, middle manager, supervisor, and individual contributor. And we did that with 4 levels, and we had competency models for each group. It took us a year and a half to create all these competency models. So every group had their own competency model, 4 levels in the competency model, 360s with every one of them. As soon as we finished that research, this company was acquired. The acquiring company looked at the research we've done, and we had built this amazing thing. And their feedback was, you've created the Tower of Babel. Well, maybe it's Babel. I'm not sure. But we created something that was so complex, nobody could use it. I mean, it was difficult to use. It was really hard. And basically, they threw it out. As I've worked with competency models over the years, what I've found really works is general and simple. So as you think about it, we need competencies that apply to across the board, competencies that apply at all different levels of the organization. Let me tell you, they're there. There's a set of behaviors that will affect the skill and will affect the outcomes at every level. And the more simple this competency model is, the more effective it's going to be, the more useful it's going to be in the organization. And you'll go to a training session, and when you say, does anybody remember the competency model? Hands will go up because they use it, and they use it in performance management, in succession planning, in selection. They use it in every aspect of their work. So as you think about it, and you think about your organization's competency model, does it create a common language? Does it provide managers with guidelines to discuss development targets? Is it simple? How many of you would say yes to all three of those? You agree with all three of those? Or I agree with none of them. Kind of put your votes in now about where you think your competency model's at and how effective it's going to be. You might want to put on your manager's hats here if you're an HR executive and think about it from their perspective. Do people really know it? Do people, when you talk about the competencies, sort of scratch their heads, or do they go, yeah, I know about that? If they're at the diving competition, do they know what really makes a difference here? As you think about yours, where do you come? Well, wow, we're all across the board on this. Interesting data. Thank you so much. So, just in summary, competency models can create a common language where when people think about what's critical here, we know what poor is, we know what good is, we know what great is. We know what a really good dive looks like and what a terrible one looks like. When you have that in an organization, you're going to be more successful. It creates a development target. People know what is critical, and they have tools that can help them develop. When you integrate that into talent management processes, it reinforces it. So when I go to leadership development, I get my competencies, and when I do performance management, same competencies, succession planning, same competencies, selection. Can you predict outcomes? Can you show the evidence? Is this an evidence-based or hope-based? If it's hope-based, good luck. Because we think every competency model can be predictive if you use the right competencies and if you do the research the right way. And the last one, probably the most important, avoid complexity. Complexity kills. If this isn't simple, it will never work. So, in a few words, what sparked your interest in our presentation today? What words come to mind? Well, I see simplicity. Yay. I think that is so critical. And common language. What words come to mind? What words pop up? Hopefully, you've been able to gain some insights today. We'd love to talk to you more about your model, about what you're doing with your model. And really, if you feel like your model is underperforming or if it's too complex, we'd love to talk to you about how we can make that simpler, easier to use, and more of a common language, and can really make a difference in your organization. We think that organizations that have really effective competency models are going to have a more successful organization, that their employees are going to be more engaged, and their performance will be better. We think these behaviors can affect outcomes. Your organization can be more effective because you have a competency model that's useful, helpful, and builds success into your organization. Thank you so much. And if you have questions, we'd love to talk.